Needless to say, I decided to change it up a little bit and get your attention with a different bumper that leads us into our discussion tonight. You know, I've decided that we feel far more comfortable dividing the world up into nice, neat categories than we do living in the trust of the mystery of who God is. Now, let me explain how I got to that place. But before I do, I probably need to introduce myself and what you have gotten yourself into. Welcome, everybody. And thanks for joining me for the Psych Monologues, a podcast that is exploring the intersection of faith, psychology, and spiritual formation. I am your humble host who gets on once every week to sometimes rant about something, or something that's been playing around in my mind that God seems to say, yeah, I think you probably should bring this out in the open for other people to think about and talk about, or at least consider. I don't profess to be the representative for everybody, but I think some of the things that I end up landing on, either through the reading that I'm doing or a sermon that I've heard, which in this case is exactly what happened, or something else that I've been mulling over and thinking about. And that's what the Psych Monologues actually are. So it is a monologue, as most podcasts are. I have no guests. So my bench of variety is very limited. But at the same time, hopefully some of the things I have to say are challenging or encouraging or thought-provoking. And certainly that's a part of why I decided to take this on and do this. And that's where we are tonight. So thanks for joining me. Thanks for giving up a half an hour or so of your time to consider what life is like for you. So pull up a chair, get comfortable, relax a little, get something to drink, coffee, hot or cold, whichever you prefer. And let me plow into a variety of issues. My hope is that it would matter to you. It touches where you live, maybe what you think and how you feel about living life with others and Jesus and even yourself. So last time I spent some time talking a little bit about a somewhat obscure word, which I thought was a missing ingredient of the spiritual journey for many people. And that was orthocardia. And we talked a little bit about the centrality of our heart and how often we emphasize believing the right things or doing the right things, otherwise known as believing, orthodoxy, or orthopraxis, doing the right things. And as I went to church this morning and took some time to listen to something that Ben Foote, our teaching pastor, had to say, it prompted and triggered a lot of thoughts in my mind about the spiritual journey itself and even how we look at life. And one of the things that caught my attention, and I wouldn't say he stumbled onto it, but he did say something that I have been wrestling with and talking about actually for quite some time. And the simple way to put it is something that I would refer to as the scourge of either or thinking. Because I think in a lot of ways, we prefer that way of thinking. We prefer dividing the world up into some very clean, neat, tidy categories that allows us to understand it. It brings clarity for us. And more importantly than anything else, it creates a certain amount of certainty that we all know is imposed on the world around us rather than provided to us by the world around us. Because there's a lot about the world around us that's uncertain. That's exactly why we do it, is it's our imposition to make it a little bit easier to understand and deal with. And it allows us to think more easily, or at least that's what we believe, So the either or thinking, and let me back up and explain this a little bit. Either or thinking is either I believe one thing or I believe the other. It's not both at all. It's one or the other. It's either this or that, and that's it. And so needless to say, there's this huge chasm between those two things. And oftentimes, which I'll get to here in a second, is it comes into our spiritual journey, particularly our relationship with God. And there was another quote that I bumped into that got me thinking, and it was by a very respected and loved figure in spiritual formation literature by the name of Brennan Manning. And he said, the minute we heal our image of ourselves, we will be healing the image of God, which says something, right? It says that our image of ourselves is directly related to our image of God. And you can also flip it. If I heal the image of God, I'm going to be healing the image of myself. Because I see through those two lenses. I see God through myself, or I see myself through God. And it's easier, certainly, like I said a minute ago, it's easier to fall into this either or thinking. I can create the categories. Now that's the upside of it. That's the positive side of it. It makes the world a little bit more understandable. It brings and allows a certain amount of clarity and certainty for us. And there are examples of people, even in Scripture, that were either or thinkers, namely the one easiest ones, we love to beat them up, is the Pharisees. It was either you were righteous or you were a sinner. It was just that simple. And if you were a sinner, you were cast out and not to be associated with. And Jesus talks a fair amount about that, the righteousness of the Pharisees. Paul does a fair amount of talking about that as well. And they divided the world up into two very convenient categories. Of course, there is plenty that the minute I divide it up into categories, I'm losing a lot more information. I'm losing some information. And this is one of my beefs, if you will, about any of the psych tests out there that categorize people into nice, neat categories. The Myers-Briggs, for example. We can divide the world up. We can divide our personalities up into 4 neat categories. And there's a variety of combinations. And if you're a lover of Myers-Briggs, bless you and go in peace. But don't come around me. I'm not very much of a fan of the Myers-Briggs. I'm not going to ostracize anybody because they are. But the Myers-Briggs reduces people. And my beef with any test like that, another very strongly favorite one of many people, is the Enneagram. And I'm equally as irritated about that one because now you're a number, which is, it just blows my mind that we chafe under the idea that we're just a number, and then we say, oh, hi, I'm a 1. And that's quaint, but I'm reducing myself to a number. And the minute I do that, I lose information, a lot of information, because it's convenient. Granted, it's convenient, and it can be useful in the sense that it destigmatizes the uniqueness of aspects of our personality, which is fine. I don't have a beef with that. My problem is that we want to live in a world that is easier to understand, and either or thinking does it for us. The reality is it divorces us from the reality that we don't live in a world that is that easily divided. And I don't want to lose information about a person that I'm trying to get to know. I want to get to know them. I want to get to know their story. I want to get to know where they come from and their experiences and the things that they've concluded. All of that. I want to get to know that. I don't really care about what categories they fit into. And that's an upside of either or thinking. It just makes it simpler and very clean, even though I think everyone that is listening would agree the world is far from clean and simple and unmessy, okay? So there's something that draws us to this kind of thinking, and some of it, dare I say it, even reduces our level of anxiety or fear living in a world that defies being reduced in so many ways, not to mention the least of which, like I said, is we don't like to be reduced. And I think it's an insult, quite honestly, to human dignity that we get reduced. So that there is an upside, and if that's appealing, then that's probably oftentimes where you land. The downside is it creates certainty and clarity where there isn't, where there might not be. And because I live in that, then there's this constant push and pull between it, between the certainty I strive to have and the uncertainty of the world that I live in. And it's an easier way to think, black or white, one or the other, on or off. It's easy to think, but easy isn't always good. Maybe it conserves on our psychological energy to be able to engage in it. But there's one thing that is so dangerous about either or thinking, and that is it feeds our drive for control and the control over things that we would rather not be reminded that we don't have control over. Now, let me just stop for a second and take a short off-ramp. The reality is that if I take a poll anywhere and ask people, do you have control over things in your life? Most of them will say, no, I really don't. But the reality is what they don't say is, but I like fooling myself into thinking that I do. And I do that with people, and I do that in a variety of other ways, and blah, 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 whatever that is, okay? Now, what's the alternative to that? So either or thinking, and it's categorical thinking, and that is a way, and I'll apply it here in a second, but that is a way for us to think. The alternative is something that we can call both and thinking. It is both this and that. Now, that's vague. I understand that. But, I can't think of a very easy example. I mean, water can be both steam and frozen ice. It can be both of those things depending on the state it's in. So it's both of those things. And I can be both caring and loving, and I can also be self-consumed and self-aggrandizing and making myself better than I am. I can do both of those things, and I am both of those things in many ways. But there's an upside and downside to this, too. The upside of both and thinking is it allows us to listen and learn from others and other viewpoints, because we're willing to consider that there's other things out there. So it's not both my opinion, but it's also another person's opinion, which is the and in there. And it often is actually where God is, because there's a mystery that exists between both of these things. Both he is loving, but he is also just, okay? Which looks like opposing ideas. So there's a mystery between what appears to be opposing ideas. And And the opposing opposition between those two things is really only apparent. It is not real, in the sense that when you really drive down into it, what you find is it's an illusory opposition. It's not a real one, if that makes any sense. The other thing I would say is both and thinking prompts trust, as opposed to the either or thinking that prompts control, or the drive for control. Because then I will live in the mystery of things that I just don't know, which means I've got to trust somebody who might, which, one of the major candidates, of course, is God. God understands all of this stuff, but there's a mystery that's on the edge of my understanding. I don't know everything. And so instead of saying, well, I just don't understand, and I trust there is more to this than meets the eye, that's usually not good enough. And quite honestly, this is where the rub is, I think, in Christian thinking, is we prefer an either or, all or nothing way of thinking than a both and some would say fuzzy way of thinking. I would say reality-based way of thinking. Now, is there a downside to both and? Yes, of course. I think in a lot of ways, being overly committed to both and oftentimes blurs clarity when there really shouldn't be that way. That things really are clear. There really is a yes and a no. There really is a good and bad. But when we blur it by saying, well, it's kind of both, then I please both sides, but I don't really divide it into saying what is good and what is bad. It can be, the dark side of this is it can be non-committal in order to not take a stand. So it paralyzes us into really not thinking critically about something or an issue, whatever it might be. And sometimes they're not a both and, it is an either or. But the challenge is it requires us to expend a lot more energy than I think, quite honestly, most of us are willing to expend on thinking about something critically enough to get a clear understanding of what it is. And, I think, quite honestly, the way we tend to think betrays our own psychology, really. And so if you like categories, if you like to divide the world up into either or, then it probably is there because it serves the purpose of supporting what makes you comfortable from a psychological point of view. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing for you, but it does mean that that's how you gravitate. Now, let me pivot and say, all right, well, now that we know that, if what I'm saying is true and what I'm pointing to is true, because the one thing I will say is that in a lot of cases we like to talk both and, but we actually think either or. And so we talk a good game about being open-minded and hearing other points of view and so on and so forth, but we think in either or ways of thinking, in categories, what's good, what's bad. So what's the example here that got me thinking? And it really was our understanding of God's role in suffering, in difficult times, in hard times. And something that I've been reading, and one of the things that I do every year is I read through Scripture, and this is my I don't know my 13th or 14th year doing that. And every year I walk through the book of Job. And quite honestly, I love Job. Job is a soulmate of mine because he doesn't pull any punches. And quite honestly, he doesn't pull any punches because he trusts the God that he is not pulling punches with. The people that are pulling punches are the ones that divide the world up into nice, clean categories. And if you're suffering the way you are, Job, then you must have sinned. You must have been evil in some way. And God is just setting the balances straight again. So how we see God's role in suffering brings with it a variety of questions. Like, does he really care that I'm experiencing this suffering? And is he really that good? Because now I will define God by the suffering I experience. And if I suffer, then God isn't good. And if I don't suffer, God is. Another category, right? So is he defined by the suffering I experience? And the reality is I have a tendency, particularly when I'm in a really tough situation or I'm experiencing kind of a bottoming out of my emotions or where I am or my energy or whatever it might be. And when I'm in that place, I have this tendency to look at life / God through the keyhole of my pain and my suffering. Which, if you've ever tried to do that, obviously it limits my view. Now, that's an assumption that my view really, if I saw more, I would think differently. And the reality is a lot of times it doesn't really matter. I can have a window or a keyhole. I'm still going to make the same assumptions I always make based on the fact that I'm in pain and I'm struggling. And the example is just that. It's a classic example. Really is portrayed very effectively and powerfully in the book The Shack. And Mac, the main character, is literally looking at life and looking at God through the keyhole of his pain and loss. So we love to talk a good game. We talk the game, if you will, of a both and, that God can both be good and suffering occurs. But I'm not sure that we entirely land there internally. That if God really loved me or whatever, then I wouldn't be going through this. Or if he really loved me, he would stop it, or whatever it might be. And the reality of our spiritual journey is that we need to figure out some way to think clearly about our experiences and engage in a both and thinking, particularly when it comes to God, who clearly, before the fall of man, set a world in motion that was not sinful, not broken, and perfect, and had no flaws in it anywhere. And then man decided to exercise control and say, I'll be like God. And we have suffered the consequences ever since. As a matter of fact, one of the consequences are our tendency to demand control over everything, over how people think, over our world around us, whatever it might be. So when it comes to that, then the idea of seeing God as good and yet still seeing and being able to hold that I live in a sinful, broken world that is not the original world that God designed, but I'm living in it, and his goodness and love for us can still remain relevant in spite of the fact that I live in a sinful, broken world, and I am one of those things. I am a sinful, broken person. And broken in not only the things that have fallen upon me, but also with the choices I make. Now, I think for a lot of us, we can intellectually assent to the fact that that applies to us. But when things start spiraling downward, we demand an explanation. And that's why either or thinking is so appealing. And that's why I can talk about this, or Ben Foote can talk about this all he wants, about learning to do both and thinking. But the problem with both, this is the dirty little secret. Either or thinking allows us to not experience uncertainty. And so we seek most of our days for certainty when you look at it. In my relationships, in my relationship with God, in how I do things, I want completion, I want closure, I want things to come to an end and then start new things. I want all of that. And so it requires, both and thinking requires us to tolerate ambiguity. And it requires us to tolerate uncertainty. And that truly is intolerable for many of us. So what interferes with our image of God is not our clarity of view about the world that we live in or the view about ourselves. I mean, I can ask anybody, and they'll pretty much be pretty clear about that, whether good or bad. Again, categories, but about God or about themselves. That's pretty well established. They're very familiar with it. But the reason and the biggest obstacle is that dealing with ambiguity and dealing with uncertainty requires a level of vulnerability that most of us see as weakness. And we don't like being reminded that we're weak. And add to that, we see weakness as a character flaw, not an inherent quality of being human. And that interferes ultimately with the very being that literally laments over the brokenness of the world that we live in, and also looks forward to the day when we can finally be entirely restored. And we miss that point. We miss it entirely because we are so taken with the world that we live in as we are. Now, the big temptation is when I describe some of these things to quickly condemn ourselves for being human. But what does that accomplish other than creating another either or? That if I wasn't this way, then it wouldn't be this way. Either I'm whole and complete, and I don't suffer the consequences of other people's behavior or mine. I don't suffer that, and then everything will be good. Or I do suffer all those things, and I must be doing something wrong. See, either or thinking tempts us into a demand for explanation because we want to, again, it goes back, I want to reduce the level of uncertainty I feel around this. And its certainty is guaranteed with a category. It's, like I said, it's either that or this. It can't be both. And if it is both, there's something fundamentally wrong, and we have to find a way to get it to fit. Both and thinking calls us to trust, and it calls us to vulnerability, and it calls us to community. Both and thinking does. And that's one of the major, I wouldn't say missing ingredients, but one of the major stumbling blocks, I think, for many people as they attempt to walk this journey with Jesus is our psychology gets in the way. That's why I'm committed to doing this podcast, because this intersection of my effort to be the disciple that walks with Jesus and learns from him is impacted by my own psychology. In other words, what I bring to this journey. And there is every bit a part of that. And then you add in my faith and my own spiritual journey and the conclusions I make. We can't do a spiritual journey without making some conclusions that oftentimes go unchecked and unevaluated until something blows them up. And then what? The then what is we go to our default, and our default is either or. Either I've done something wrong and I'm being punished, or God's bad, or not as powerful as he says, or isn't as good as he says, and now he's defined by the difficulty and suffering and the things that I am experiencing. So this begins to look at or bring into sharp kind of view our real obstacle. Not the obstacle, I just can't believe the right things. We talked about that last week. Or I just can't seem to do it quite right. And if I did it quite right, then my beliefs and my practices would match. But see, our heart, what we're not wrestling with is the contours of our own heart and the conclusions we have made about various aspects of our own hearts. And there's a conclusion there. There are parts of us that we have condemned, which means that if I've condemned them, I hide them. And it's the last thing I want to do is to bring them out into the open, because, of course, that makes me vulnerable. But yet, I am in this position where I long to be known, but I'm afraid to be known because I assume that people will conclude about me what I'm already concluding about myself. The interesting thing about that, which goes back to Brennan's quote that I said earlier in the podcast, is if I heal my image of me, how I understand who I am, and I'm not talking about self-consumption or elevating the self above all things. I am not talking about that at all. But if I understand what my needs are for trust and protection and vulnerability and connection, if I understand those, then I have half a shot, because so often my image of God is self-defined. As Blaise Pascal famously said, God made man in his own image, and man returned the favor. And so there's this interactive effect between our image of God and our image of ourselves. And that's the challenge even of what we're doing on this spiritual journey. The conversation and the connection that we can have with one another in honest, vulnerable conversations that isn't hiding behind talking about all the right things, but talking about life as it really is, not as it should be. That is the crucible in which we heal both of these things. My image of myself as God's beloved, and my image of God as passionately loving and passionately loving me as I am. I mean, in a lot of ways, God loves me better than I love me, because He knows me as I am. Not as I should be. That doesn't exist. Just as I am. And even in human relationships, that can be accomplished. As a matter of fact, a lot of us are far more willing to accept people as they are than they are themselves, and vice versa. And that's the basis on which things begin to change. but you can't have trust without risk. We'd love to have trust and trust people without any risk at all. But it's impossible. Just on the flip side, which I'm known for saying all the time, is control and trust can't coexist. If I'm going to control things, then there can't be trust. Control is meant to reduce risk. As a matter of fact, it's there to erase risk. And so I choose my friends carefully because I want to be able to know the people that I have in my life. I can manage their perceptions of me easier than people who don't know me and interact with me just on the basis of what they see and what they hear, rather than knowing me over a long period of time and a long interactions, a lot of interactions with me. So something to consider. It's tough to nail that down because it sounds a little abstract, right? I mean, either or thinking versus both and thinking. But there's something to that where there is a irritating but inviting mystery in God's ultimate goodness and love for me, and that I live in a broken and sin-stained world that he grieves over just like us. And he grieves over because of what we experience in it too. And we've got an even bigger question that we have to deal with. Does it matter? Does it even matter that God is in it with us? Because I think in some respects, and I'll just say for myself, I don't know anybody else, what anybody else experiences or concludes, but sometimes it doesn't matter whether he's in it with me or not, because I just want it changed and fixed. I don't really care whether he's in it or not. That doesn't give me any source of comfort. If I'm being deadly honest, that's how that goes. And yet, it can be developed and altered and shifted in my interactions with his people who are also trying to learn how to do that. It's not. I'm not going to do it in a silo by myself. I'm not, because it's 2-on-1. It's me, 3-on-1. Me, myself, and I against God. And we've already decided who God is and how he is and all that. So it's a stacked deck against us in that regard. So something to consider for your Sunday evening or Monday or Tuesday, whenever you're listening to this. And something to look at and see if you see that pattern in yourself. And that's what all of these things are here for. It isn't to give you a solution. It is to help you understand and maybe have a deeper understanding. And then out of that comes the wisdom to engage your journey in a particularly trust-filled and locking arms with other way. It's kind of a clunky way to say it, but be that as it may. Food for thought for the evening. Thanks for joining me. A few things of reminder, as I always do at the end of the podcast. If you have questions or reactions to some of the stuff that I've said, please DM me on Instagram. I'd love to hear your thoughts or questions or reactions to some of this. If you want to subscribe, obviously you can do that on Instagram or any social media platform where we can be found or I can be found. On Instagram is @the_psych_monologues. On Facebook, it's ray.mitch, and LinkedIn, it's drmitch. And as far as the podcast is concerned, it can be found on any podcast provider that you prefer: Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, whatever you prefer. We can be found on any of those platforms. and you can certainly subscribe there as well. If what you're listening to is something that you enjoy and you like, we can always benefit from a positive review, a review about what you're hearing and the nature of it, just to help people discover it more. And I have a blog on the website at drmitsch, Mitsch, don't forget the S, .com. We've got a blog that will slowly but surely start having new entries, so you can follow that and check in on that. And then finally, if you're interested in partnering with us to continue to grow our scholarship fund for students or alums of CCU or other universities, you can do so by your tax-deductible gifts to CCU Silent Retreat. And you can do that by using the donation button or donate button at the bottom of the front page of our website. And that will take you to a page where you can determine if you want to make a monthly contribution, which would be immensely appreciated, or a one-time contribution. Either way would be greatly helpful to make it possible for students that are just getting going, may not have a lot of funds to be able to afford a retreat like that, to attend and find out more about their relationship with God, and find out more about what I've been talking about tonight. If you'd rather contribute through a check, you can do that as well. You can simply address your envelope to 1615.tv, P.O. Box 1777, Castle Rock, Colorado, 80104. The check itself can be made out to 1615.tv. And that would be immensely helpful, and also we would be immensely grateful for your participation with us to make a silent retreat, which is fundamentally different than any other retreat kind of experience most people have had, to take a couple of days in silence and solitude to see what God has to say to us about the things that are most important in our life. I will be honest, that is the place that I learned the most about the very thing I talked about in today's podcast. So thanks so much for joining me. Thanks for sitting down for 40 minutes or so of your time to consider some thoughts about how we think and how we see God and how we journey with others and with Jesus as well. And as always, love ya. Later. Bye.